All right, everyone. Welcome to a new section. Okay. By the time you're seeing this video, you should be completing up your assignment 2, which is the, prototyping and such like that. So, we're kind of in the last sort of third or part of the course. And, the first part was, kind of basic HTML and CSS. You learned what HTML was, you learned what CSS was, and we got, we kind of learned CSS, and when we talk about CSS, I personally break CSS into two kind of categories. Okay, this is my sort of thing. It's not like an official a term that other web developers necessarily use or anything, but I kind of say, like, okay, we have what I call visual CSS, which is anything that you can see. So that would be font color, like color, or font family, or background color, or background image, something that is visual that you can literally see, right? And the next part, the second part is kind of, or I guess, the second major area is what I call layout CSS. Okay. And layout CSS is about taking that content, the text, the images, things that have been stylized with colors and whatnot, and laying them out. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, we've kind of imagined this is like a p tag or like a div or a section tag. We've kind of learned that there's something called box model. And what box model allows you to do is to apply a width. Sorry, this is annotation is going to be a little bit not the greatest. And a height. Okay. That says height, right? That's pretty good. Pretty good. So anyway, there's also some other elements. We talked about padding. Padding is sort of the distance or the sort of the buffer zone between the content and the edge of the tag itself. That's padding. You can also have a border, which is like a literal kind of line or a style that goes around um, your container. So like if you've ever used something like Adobe Illustrator or even in Figma, that would be like a stroke, where it's like you're setting this. I have this design that kind of goes around the perimeter of my box. And then we talked about, well, if you have more than one, if since everything is a box model, you can actually set the distance. Oops, why can't I? There we go. You can also set the distance between two objects or two, box model objects, including the page itself, and that's the margin. Okay. And just to kind of quickly kind of go over this, I'm just gonna kind of do this. So I have here's this page here. I have a couple of divs with some text in it. And let's preview that, and this is what it looks like. All right. And so each of my each of these divs defaultly, they are block elements, and block elements, if you remember, go the width of its parent. The parent in this case is the body. So each one of these goes the full width. That's kind of the default of the browser. That's the user agent. That's how it normally works. But sometimes we may want to set a width. So I could come in here and I could say, okay, let's do, just gonna select it using an ID selector and say width 500. Let's add a background color to make it a little easier to see. And if I come back, okay. So you can see now I have actually defined width. So if I click on this, you can see actually right there, it says 500. We can set a height. Normally the height of an object or, a container is the amount of content. So, if I have more content, it's taller. If I have less content, it's shorter. So, right now, this container is 277.5. If I were to come in here and, I don't know, just get rid of half the text like this, because there's less content, it should get shorter. And now this is 148. Okay. If you want to set your own height, you can do that. I usually recommend that you don't set both a width and a height. There's better ways of doing it, but you can do it. And, there are situations where you may want to do it. So I'm just kind of showing it to you. So this is general box model, right? So it's like we're starting to do layout. We're saying how wide is something? How tall is something? I can do other elements like padding. So I'm going to say, okay, let's add a little bit of space between the edges. That's 25 pixels. And I can add a border. So I'm going to add a black border around my container here. Okay. And then I'm going to set to do margin. I'm going to set up this other one here. Why don't we also make this 500 pixels with a background color of orange. And I'll also give it a padding just for fun. Let's do the same amount. Okay. Now you can see here that these are touching each other, right? And that's because if I look, these elements come right after each other and there's no real space, right? And that's what the margin is, if you remember. Margin is the buffer zone between two HTML elements. Okay, so this is an HTML element, this is an HTML element. So if I come into here and I say margin, let's just do 50 pixels. What that's going to do is actually put 50 pixels on the top, left, right, and bottom. And it's actually pushing this away, as you can see. Not only is it pushing off of this away, it's actually pushing itself off of the body. Okay, so what's actually happening here is my div container is actually inside. I'm just going to make this a different color. So normally what was actually happening was it was like this, and then when you added that buffer or the margin, it was pushing off of the body itself. And that's why we end up with something like this. You can solve that by just applying it to one side and not necessarily to every four sides. So remember, with any box model property, you can just put the side, top, left, right, or bottom. If this is a little confusing, I might recommend going back to my module where I kind of go over this more in depth and more practice, but I just kind of want to go over this as just a general concept of very, very basic layout. Okay. And that's kind of where we've been. And you guys did a whole assignment one based on that. What we're going to be doing now is getting into advanced layout. Okay. So with box model, we can set width and height. That's kind of the major thing that we're concerned with here, right? But sometimes in a design, we are going to want to not just have a single column, but we're going to want to have kind of like an advanced layout where there's multiple columns. So let's, like, for instance, go to, I don't know, Amazon. So it's like you can see that there's this column of content here, column there, column there, column there. So there's, when I say column, I mean like there's a horizontal separation in content, right? This content doesn't go all the way to the edge of the website. In fact, it's broken up into about a 25% area here, right? You guys kind of see that? Or why don't we just do Chabot College itself? So, same thing here. It's like this is a column, and then, you know, two columns here. Let's actually take me to a different website that I don't necessarily want to do. This is a column, this is a column, right? And so each one of these is like kind of that box, but they're kind of being displayed next to each other, okay? And that's what we're going to be doing is more with layout. When it comes to layout, there's a couple of different techniques we can use using CSS, but the two biggest and the two most important by far would be CSS Grids, which is what we're going to cover today, and then CSS Flexbox. Okay. All right, so let's talk about CSS Grids. And to understand CSS Grids, let's think about something kind of like Microsoft Excel sheets, or Google Sheets or spreadsheet or whatever sort of system that you use to lay out content in columns and rows. So you guys have probably done this at some point, I'm assuming. And what I'm going to do is, like, let's just say for the sake of argument, I'm just going to put some content here. So I'm going to call this cell 1, cell 2, cell 3, cell 4, cell 5, cell 6, cell 7, cell 8, cell 9. All right, so I've laid out my content, and you'll notice that the content is separated by column. So it's like I can have the columns thinner or wider. Okay. I can also change the height of my columns too, or my rows, I should say. So it's like, okay, I could take this and make it taller or shorter. And once you kind of have this layout, which is great, and a lot of design works off the idea of grids. Once again, by the way, just going back to here, it's like you see how everything kind of lines up as a grid. Like you see how even this is like, see how everything kind of lines up nicely here. So this is where a lot of design, whether digital or non-digital, typically kind of follows like a grid system. So it's like you have these elements, they all kind of line up here. All of these are kind of lining up. These kind of line up here, right? So this is like, if I was doing this in my Excel spreadsheet, it's like, this would be that column 1. This might be that column 2. Okay. So what we're trying to do with CSS grids is make columns and then also rows like this. And then the idea is, once you have kind of rows and columns, let me go back to my spreadsheet, you can actually take the content in the table cell itself, and you could say, for instance, put it on the right side, put it on the left side, oops, put it in the center. Now that's horizontal, but if there's enough space, like there's some vertical space here, I could also put it at the top, put it at the bottom, or put it in the center. Okay. And that's what we're going to be doing today, is using CSS grids to create a basic layout. And then once we've done that layout, we can actually use CSS grids again, if we feel like it, to place things vertically in the middle, horizontally, vertical, center, or, place things on the left, right, or middle of a container, which is something that we've not really been able to do easily before. Okay. All right, so let's get into grid basics. So I'm going to go to exercise 2 here. And what we're going to do is open up exercise 2. And before we do anything, I just want you to kind of look at the HTML And what I want you to notice is I have this div, and the div has a class of container on it. And I have 6 direct children. Okay. These are children of the div. Okay. And they're direct children. This matters because when you apply CSS grids, the grid effect only applies to its direct children, not to. So in other words, what I mean by that is the grid would not apply to this or to this because that's not a direct child of this. If I apply it to the container, okay. So I have this, and let's just kind of look at what I'm trying to build so you get kind of an idea. So I'm trying to make this 2-column layout like this, where the first column is like 200 pixels or 300, and the second one is 900 or 600, sorry. And so we can actually do this pretty well as long as your setup is pretty well done. So all of these sections are direct children here. And what I'm going to do is say container. And we are going to do display. Now, if you remember, we used display before to change like a block into an inline and an inline into a block. So for instance, you might remember we had something like this where it's like if I had a couple of headings, although let's make them in H3 because I think I don't want to affect the stuff inside of my container here. I'm just going to preview this. And currently, everything's just kind of, these are, if you remember, headings are block elements, which means they defaultly take up the width. Okay, now you could use like fit content, which I've talked about before, so they don't take up the whole width. So I could say width equals content, and then technically it kind of ends there. But you'll notice they're still displaying on top of each other, right? So by default, headings display as a block, which means they take up 100% of their parent. And so at least by default, unless you apply other CSS, blocks will never be next to each other horizontally. They only, they'll display vertically. But let's say I wanted these to act like an inline element. I could come into here and say display inline. Okay, and actually that's applying it to the direct one. Let's come into here, display inline. So when I do that, these now kind of act like an inline element, like say a strong tag or an EM tag. Okay. I could also kind of do it the other way here. Let's do a bunch of strong tags. Strong. I'm just going to copy this a couple times. I'm just going to give it a background color so it's a little easier to see. So I have these strong elements. Strong elements by default are inline. As if I click on these, you can see if I go under computed, see how it says layout, display, inline. Okay, so that's the default of the browser. But what I could do is come back and say, well, yeah, I know they normally act like an inline, but I want them to display as a block. And if I come back, these are now acting like a block, meaning they're going to take up the entire width of the page by default. They're 100% of their parent, just like a heading or a section tag would be or something like that. Okay. You might have remembered when I did this before, when I was talking about odds and ends a couple weeks ago. Well, not only can we use display to make something from a block to an inline or an inline to a block, we can also actually use it to make something a grid. Okay, so what I'm going to say is normally this div, I'm just going to get rid of this. Normally a div is a block element, but I would like it to act or display like a grid. Okay. So in other words, what we're doing is we're telling the browser to change the way that the tag displays its content. Okay. In this case, we're saying make it display like a grid. Now, if I go back and I refresh this, you're not going to really see anything. And that's because when you make something into a grid, the browser doesn't defaultly know how many columns you want. Remember, part of a grid is knowing, how many columns there are. If I had only 2 columns, I would have to, oops, looks like I accidentally shifted some stuff around here. If I only had 2 columns, this would have to wrap around, and then like this would become, the 3 would come down here, and 4 would move there, and 5 would move there, and then so on and so on, right? So in other words, you know, for the browser to do its job, it needs to know how many columns there are so it can take all of the cells that you've created and then place them out direct, in the correct order. So what I'm going to do is we're going to use another property called grid template columns. Okay. Now, both of these have to be applied to the parent, not to the children. Okay. What you're saying here is how many columns are there and what is their width? So, if I had this, what we're trying to do right now is we're trying to have a design where basically the first column is 300 and the second column, oops, is 600 or something like this. All right. Let's give it a background color. So in other words, we're trying to do something kind of like this. So how do we do this in terms of code? Well, I could come in here and say 300. I guess my instructions, I said 200 and then 500. Okay. So what this means is I'm going to have 2 columns. The first column is going to be width of 200 and the second column is going to be width of 500. Let's preview this in a browser. And you can see it's giving me what we wanted. Now, what I'm going to do is let's take a look at this. Your browser actually has developer tools that let you look at this, especially if you're using like Chrome or Firefox. So if I'm going to go right-click, inspect, and you'll notice that my container has this little pill item here that says grid. If I click on that, first thing it actually does is it will literally show you the grid in your browser. So you can see how it's like, showing me these lines here, showing me the columns. This is my column 1. This is my column 2. Once you click this on, you can click it on and off to sort of turn it on and off. It's basically like an overlay. You can actually go under layout, and if you're in Chrome, this is the color. See how it says grid overlay, and it's saying container. Right now it's like a peach. Maybe I want it like a really dark red, or I like to use a color that kind of contrasts really well. And so I'm doing that, and then if I can also actually look at the show track sizes. So that means the width. So you can see how it says 200 there and it says 500 there. Okay. Now let's just say for the sake of argument, I wanted to switch this from a 200, 500, 2-column layout to maybe, let's say I wanted a 3rd column. Okay. How could I do that? Well, I'm just going to add it. So what this means is I have 3 columns. First column is 200 pixels, second column is 500 pixels, and last column, the 3rd column, is 200 pixels. Save. So the columns don't have to be equal. They can be different measurements. I'm using pixels, but you can, as I'm going to show you, you can use different measurements if you wanted to use points or eventually I'll show you percentages and things like that. You can do that too. And if I right click and turn this on, it's kind of annoying it doesn't save your color. I don't really know if there's a way to make it sticky, but 200, 500, and 200. Okay. All right, I'm going to do one more thing. All right, let's go to exercise 3. And once again, before I do anything, let's just kind of like look at the layout, because it's important that your layout is correct to get the correct CSS grids. So it's very similar to the last one where I have this parent container called container. It's just a div with a class on it. And then these are the direct children. Okay. These are all about different animals. And let's just preview this real quick. It looks like this. since they're all, I think they're section tags, right? Yeah. Section tags are blocks, so they defaultly go, the width of the entire page, unless you apply some sort of CSS to it, which I haven't yet. And what I want to do is make this into a 2-column layout. So I'm just going to go here and I'm going to say, okay, container, and then display grids to change it from displaying defaultly as a block into making this a grid. I'm going to save and, oops, I'm on the wrong page. Yeah, there we go. This isn't actually going to do anything because once again, it needs to know how many columns we're going to have. So I'm going to say grid template columns plural, and I'm going to make the first one 400 and the second one 400 just for right now. Okay, I'm going to save and let's preview that. And okay, cool. And I'm just going to click on this and once again change this to like a deep blue, and you can see that this is 400 and this is 400, right? And let's look at the layout of my page. Now, it did do what I wanted in that I now have this like column layout, and that's cool, but you'll notice that when I use like a finite amount, like pixels, like 400 pixels and 400 pixels, it's like, okay, well, if this is 400 and this is 400, the total of this is 800, right? Higher math and all that. But the problem with that is like, well, I have all this empty space here that's not really being used. My browser is bigger than 800 pixels. I'm guessing, 1500 or something like that. So I have like about 700 pixels that's not really being used. And from a design point of view, this is kind of like not great. Another thing is when you set a exact width of something in a browser, if your browser was to ever get smaller than that width, it's going to crop some of it off. It's not going to defaultly realign itself. So in other words, what I mean is that this is 800 and it always has to be 800 because we've defined exact values here. But if I were to come in here and take my browser and do this, see how it's like cropping off this, right? So what can we do? Well, let's just say for the sake of argument, I want the first column to always be 400. I'm not willing to budge on that. But I don't really care how wide the next column is, like the second column, right? What we could do is, well, you can use something like auto. You might remember auto when we applied it for margin. When we applied it for margin, what we basically said was take all the available space. Auto basically means use all the available space, okay? So what this is saying is, well, this is going to be, the first column is going to be 400 pixels, whatever. That's non-negotiable. But whatever space is left over, that's, let's use not yellow, but maybe like a red. That's going to be my auto. Okay, so in other words, whatever space is left, that's going to be my second column. So, if this is 600, it's 600. If it's 1,000, it's 1,000. If it's 200, it's 200. It's more of a relative value. So I'm going to save and refresh. And you can see now that this second column doesn't have a specific width. In fact, if I click on it, you can see how when it's set to auto, and if I were to actually, select this, see how this is taking up all of the available space. So everything in this column so it doesn't matter if it's big or it's small. It's just taking up whatever space is available. Okay. Let's just say for the sake of argument, I wanted the first column to be 400, but then I want 2 columns. But once again, I don't really need to give them a specific size. So what I could do is say, well, 400 auto. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that take the width of your page. Let's just hypothetically say that the width of my page is 1,000. The first column is a finite value. It's 400, right? So what that means is that, okay, if the width of the page is 1,000, 1,000 minus 400, I have 600 pixels of available space. Since I have two autos, what that means is it's going to take the available space and then divide it by the number of autos. In this case, 2. So each column in this example should be 300 pixels. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. So what I'm going to do is save. And the second and the third column are going to take the available space and redistribute it equally. Notice how these two are equal to each other. All right. All right, that was a lot, but I want you guys to try that out. Just get used to kind of applying very basic grids kind of to content. In the next video, we're going to go over some more stuff with grids. This includes using percentages, setting up rows, which we haven't talked about yet, row heights, and then gaps, and then something called a fraction, which is basically the way that you're going to probably see most people write CSS code to create to set widths of columns and stuff. Okay.